The freight depot in Concordia, Kansas is officially ordinary, a one-story red brick building opened in 1917 by the Missouri Pacific Railroad, later repurposed as the National Orphan Train Complex. The plaque out front calls it a railroad freight depot. The museum brochures talk about social reform, child rescue, westward hope. Inside the archive, a 1920s photograph shows a line of children on the platform, hats too big, coats too thin. Behind them, the depot's brickwork is unsettlingly precise, perfectly mirrored window arches, a cornice course that hits exactly the same brick count on both elevations, and a foundation line that, in older photos, sits higher above the ground than it does today. In Tartaria circles, the same depot appears in videos about reset kids, children said to be repopulating a world after a 19th century mud flood moved through what some researchers call surviving Tartarian infrastructure. I came here to study one building. The brickwork keeps pointing somewhere else. The day I first stood on East 6th Street in Concordia, the depot did not look like the kind of place that could carry a theory. Official railway documents list it as a freight station completed in 1917, built to standard Missouri Pacific specifications, brick load-bearing walls, timber roof trusses, concrete platform. The Orphan Train Museum panels inside repeat that story. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 200,000 children rode west from crowded cities, processed in rooms like the freight hall now filled with exhibits. The narrative is humanitarian, complex and thoroughly documented: poverty, reformers, train schedules. But the building nagged at me. In a 1918 photograph of the depot, the sill of the end windows sits a clear step above the platform. In a contemporary shot from the same angle, the brickwork below the sill is almost flush with the concrete. The grade has crept upward. Part of the original facade now functions as a retaining wall. The lowest bricks, glazed and finely finished, were never meant to be underground. In Tartaria forums, these before and after comparisons are catalogued as mud flood windows, evidence they claim that a worldwide deluge of liquefied earth half-buried an older civilization's structures. Mainstream railway histories describe nothing more dramatic than platform raising, drainage work, and decades of resurfacing. Somewhere between those explanations lies a simpler fact. This depot, now a memorial to transported children, has itself been slowly buried. Its architecture records a vertical movement no one mentions in the museum script. If the ground moved here, what about the buildings where those children came from? In the freight room, exhibits walk visitors through immigration, labor, and 19th century poverty. One wall displays a large photograph of a New York departure. Children, numbered tags pinned to their coats, stand before a building that is technically not part of the story, a background facade with giant round arched windows and a rusticated stone base. The caption talks about Charles Loring Brace and the Children's Aid Society. The building itself, with its precise masonry joints and over-engineered arches, goes unnamed. It has the look of what Tartarian researchers love to collect: oversized stonework, too fine for a charity office, arches wide enough to frame industrial-scale doorways, now glazed and subdivided. In the museum archive, I read the Orphan Train movement summaries, dates, numbers, routes. Between mid-19th century and 1929, children left depots in New York and other cities bound for rural homes. Parallel programs, British Home Children to Canada, for example, moved more than 100,000 minors through similarly imposing urban homes and receiving houses. Tartaria focused sites overlay those same dates with a different frame. They point to photographic records of empty city streets, half-buried facades, and suddenly crowded orphanages as evidence of a reset, adults gone, children redistributed. I make a note that is not a conclusion, just an observation. When historians talk about these deported children, they focus on the movement across space. The buildings that anchored that movement, depots, orphanages, receiving homes, are treated as scenery. In Tartarian discussions, those buildings are the main characters. To understand that architectural obsession, I needed to see one of those urban homes in the archives. In Bloomsbury, London, the Foundling Hospital appears in 18th and 19th century engravings as a vast brick complex with long wings, a central chapel, and courtyards ordered with almost military symmetry. Construction began in the 1740s. The institution admitted thousands of abandoned children for more than a century. Official histories emphasize philanthropy. Thomas Coram's campaign, William Hogarth's paintings, and Handel's benefit concerts describe an early modern charity, not a Victorian mystery. Yet the building's plan reads like something else. With axial approaches, a chapel aligned on a central axis, and flanking wings seemingly sized more like barracks or hospitals than a home. By the mid-19th century, Parliament briefly ordered the hospital to accept all children brought to its doors. Intake records spike, an administrative flood not of mud but of infants. Later, overcrowding and reform shift policy. Children are moved to countryside facilities, then again to new purpose-built campuses. Tartaria theorists seize on the imagery, a monumental institution suddenly absorbing foundlings in great numbers, then relocating them out of a changing city whose streetscapes show half-buried facades and rapid rebuilding. They splice Foundling Hospital engravings into narratives about a depopulated old world, its Tartarian children warehoused and redistributed after a reset. My notes stay narrower. The Foundling Hospital demonstrates that long before the orphan trains, Europe already had large-scale child housing complexes designed with military-grade planning and served by substantial water and drainage infrastructure. The symmetry is too perfect for mere charity. The scale exceeds what orphan care would seem to require. If Tartaria exists anywhere in this story, it will be in the pipes, not the paintings. In one survey of the Foundling Hospital site, I find an overlooked detail: a plan of the 18th century drainage and water systems. The hospital grounds were served by wells, cisterns, and brick-lined sewers leading to London's wider network. The drawing is matter-of-fact, but the geometry is not. The main drains run in straight lines beneath the courtyards, intersecting at regular intervals. Cisterns are placed at axial nodes, directly under what appear above ground as turning points in the building's layout. The system is more than adequate for a charitable institution. It resembles the foundational infrastructure of a much larger complex, scaled down by occupation, not by design. Tartarian writers argue that such overbuilt hydraulic systems, particularly when tied to highly symmetrical ground plans, are signatures of Tartarian infrastructure. They describe a standardized substructure reused and rebranded. In their framing, the Foundling Hospital did not merely care for unwanted children, it occupied a fragment of a pre-existing Tartarian grid. Mainstream architectural historians credit Georgian rationalism, symmetry as a moral and aesthetic ideal, and efficient drainage as enlightened concern for health. Both readings fit the visible evidence, but neither fully addresses the sense of scale that pervades the infrastructural drawing. In the museum courtyard today, children play on grass above those old lines of brick. The drains still work quietly. The original building is gone, demolished in the 20th century, yet the buried geometry remains, influencing the layout of Coram's fields and the modern Foundling Museum. A conservation report from 1987 notes that excavation for new utilities encountered existing brick culverts not shown on any Georgian plan. The finding was recorded without comment. The same pattern appears again, thousands of kilometers away, under a receiving home for British migrant children in Canada. Between 1869 and 1932, over 100,000 British home children arrived in Canada, processed through receiving homes run by organizations like Barnardo's and the McPherson Home in Knowlton, Quebec. These were not huts. Archival photographs show imposing red brick buildings with steep roofs, central entrances framed by oversized arches, and basement windows half buried behind sloping lawns. Canadian government guides treat these homes as social history, waypoints in a juvenile emigration movement shaped by Victorian morality and economic demand for farm labor. Architectural description rarely goes beyond institutional Gothic or brick Victorian. In Tartaria adjacent channels, the same images circulate under different captions: Tartarian reset depots and Old World orphan repositories. Commenters note the heavy stone foundations, the disproportionate height of ground floor ceilings, and the alignment of window rows with now submerged courses. When I compare floor plans, a familiar logic emerges. Dormitories occupy long wings and central halls intersect them at right angles. Service basements host laundry, boiler rooms and storage, all heavily dependent on water supply and drainage. Yet in some renovation records, engineers mention encountering earlier brickwork and existing culverts not shown on the builder's original drawings. The official narrative explains such findings as normal layering, earlier farm buildings, village sewers, and ad hoc drains. Tartarian interpreters read them as evidence that these child migration homes were slotted onto an inherited infrastructural chassis, possibly of Tartarian origin. A structural report from 1923 describes an existing barrel-vaulted chamber beneath the north wing of one Ontario receiving home, its purpose unrecorded, its construction predating the institution by unknown decades. The engineer recommended sealing it rather than investigating further. Whether or not Tartaria lies beneath these foundations, the migration of children clearly rode atop an older, more complex landscape than the brochures admit. If children were moved, they passed through railway stations. The orphan train routes terminated in modest depots across the American Midwest, but they began in some of the most ambitious urban rail halls of the 19th century. Historic photographs of New York's depots and piers show cavernous interiors with iron trusses spanning improbable distances decorated with classical motifs. These structures are well documented as products of industrial capitalism, but they also exhibit traits that Tartarian researchers highlight as too advanced, including vast, clear spans, smooth ashlar masonry, and rows of arched openings now partly buried by raised pavements. Engineering journals from the period describe the use of hydraulic lifts, underground cisterns for firefighting, and elaborate drainage for smoke and steam. It was a hidden plumbing of water and air beneath every timetable. The infrastructure exceeds what passenger and freight movement alone would seem to require. In Tartaria narratives, these stations and ports are annexes of a larger system, not merely moving people and freight, but redistributing populations after a civilizational reset. The orphan trains and British child migration schemes are reinterpreted as logistics operations to repopulate territories once part of a Tartarian empire, now rebranded. I remain anchored to what I can verify. The architecture is real, the water systems are sophisticated, and the child movements are heavily documented. The interpretive overlay, whether you call it benevolent reform, exploitative labor routing, or Tartarian repopulation, sits atop the same physical platforms, the same buried infrastructure. A maintenance log from Grand Central's predecessor terminal, dated 1891, notes the sealing of lower-level passages containing equipment of undetermined origin. No inventory was made before the concrete was poured. To untangle interpretation from evidence, I turn to the maps that first named and then erased Tartaria. In a quiet map room, I lay an 18th century atlas beside a 20th century immigration chart. On one, a large swath of Eurasia is labelled Great Tartary. On the other, arrows track the movement of British home children from ports like Liverpool to Canadian harbours and inland receiving homes. Academic articles explain Tartary as a vague term European cartographers used for steppe regions they did not yet fully map. Modern encyclopedias describe the Tartarian Empire as a conspiracy theory that imagines a suppressed advanced civilization destroyed by a mud flood. Yet, when I overlay routes of 19th century child migration onto later maps of industrial networks, a visual metaphor emerges. Lines of movement, orphan trains and emigrant children flow outwards from imperial centres toward regions that earlier maps had labelled vaguely, then more concretely as part of expanding colonial and industrial systems. In Tartarian storytelling, those blank and then overwritten spaces become the heartland of a lost empire. The child migrations become repopulation directives in that telling. In mainstream historiography, they are tools of social policy and economic exploitation. The maps themselves prove neither claim. They do show one undeniable fact. What early mapmakers drew as undifferentiated Tartary later became precisely the territories targeted for resource extraction, rail expansion, and often large-scale population movement, including children. The architectural traces we now debate, red brick institutions, star-like fortifications, and overbuilt waterworks, sit within that evolving cartographic story. A note in an 1847 surveyor's journal describes encountering a foundation grid in rural Ontario that predated known settlement, aligned precisely with compass bearings. The surveyor recorded it as anomalous and moved on. Under those maps, under those buildings, lies the one element mud flood Tartaria theorists and cautious engineers both obsess over: mud and what it covers. At a certain point, you have to open the controversy directly. Mud. Flood theory claims that sometime in the mid to late 19th century, a global cataclysm buried cities in meters of liquefied soil, partially submerging what are presented as Tartarian buildings. Afterwards, the story goes, orphan trains and other child migration schemes were used to repopulate the emptied world with pliable, historyless children. Mainstream geology finds no evidence for a single worldwide mud event of that type. Photographs used as proof often turn out to depict local floods, basements, or ordinary level changes. Historians of the orphan train movement and British home children document very human causes: urban poverty, industrialization, and labor demand in rural colonies. In the archives, architectural evidence exists that both sides point to: buildings with ground floors turned into basements, streets raised over time, windows half buried, and institutional complexes whose original lower entries now open into soil. Tartaria researchers string these into a single narrative of catastrophe and cover up. Conservation architects talk about damp courses, flood mitigation, and the cumulative effect of laying new paving over old. Both recognize that the visible ground line is often not the original one. Standing in Concordia or in front of a Canadian receiving home, I cannot see a global flood. I can see that the buildings which processed children after the mid-19th century are often older than their current entrances suggest, and that their hydraulic systems are in many cases older and more complex than their charitable facades. A renovation report from a former British receiving home in Hamilton, Ontario, dated 1952, notes that workers encountered a lower floor level approximately 4 feet below the existing basement, with finished brickwork and evidence of former habitation. The discovery was recorded in a single paragraph. No further investigation was authorized. If something was buried, physically or historically, the best place to look for it is in the sub-levels. Renovation plans have a way of revealing what polite history ignores. In documents for retrofitting a former British receiving home, a structural engineer notes an existing barrel vault beneath the north wing, not shown on the 19th century architect's drawings, repurposed as coal and water storage. The vault's construction predates the institution by unknown decades. In a New York orphanage's basement blueprint, an unlabeled corridor jogs away from the main service spine, ending in a brick wall. No original explanation is given. A later hand scribbles seal off. In Concordia's depot, maintenance notes mention an old drainage culvert under the east platform, retained. These are not dramatic revelations, they are quiet, administrative notations, buried in files that almost no one reads. For a conventional historian, these are curiosities, layers of use in cities that have been built and rebuilt for centuries. For Tartaria-focused investigators, they are crucial, evidence that institutions processing children sat atop inherited networks of tunnels, cisterns and conduits, precisely the kind of buried infrastructure they attribute to Tartarian engineering. What I can say is that these sub-levels complicate any neat story. Children lodged in dormitories above may never have known that their beds stood over vaulted spaces sized for something else. The building's charitable functions rode on a physical chassis whose origin is, in many cases, undocumented. An 1897 inspection report for a Toronto children's home describes a sub-basement accessible only through a sealed hatch, containing brick channels of unknown purpose connecting to the municipal sewer at a depth inconsistent with city records. The inspector recommended permanent closure rather than investigation. Whenever modern renovation closes off another passage or fills another void with concrete, a little more of that inherited architecture disappears, making later interpretations, humanitarian, exploitative, or Tartarian, harder to test. Above ground, however, another pattern is easier to see, a shared architectural language across the very different places where these children were gathered and sent. Whether in London, New York, or rural Canada, many 19th century child institutions share a similar set of features: symmetrically arranged facades, oversized entries framed by classical or Gothic detailing, and internal plans organized around central halls with radiating corridors. A survey of orphanages and industrial schools shows repeated use of red brick with stone dressings, patterned ventilation grills at basement level, and high ground floors reached by short flights of steps. In some historic photographs, these steps are taller than they are today, the lower risers now hidden behind landscaping or paving. In Tartaria discourse, this is the classic profile of Tartarian architecture: imposing yet functionally ambiguous shells, allegedly designed for hydroelectrical or atmospheric purposes, later downgraded to mundane roles like schools and homes. The fact that so many such buildings end up housing orphanages, foundling hospitals, or receiving homes feeds the story that Tartarian children were being stored in their ancestors' infrastructure. Architectural historians, by contrast, link this grandeur to Victorian moral messaging: discipline embodied in symmetry, charity wrapped in respectable facades. The overdoing of style is seen as social theatre, not technical inheritance. Yet as I trace one bricked-up basement window after another, the repeated choice to place vulnerable children inside architectural shells, originally sized and serviced for something larger, remains a quietly disconcerting fact. The buildings are too grand for their stated purpose. The infrastructure beneath them is too complex for mere drainage. The symmetry is too precise for hand-drawn plans executed by local builders. A construction journal from an 1873 orphanage in upstate New York notes that the foundation walls were built atop existing footings of superior quality, their origin unknown. The builder recorded the observation without further comment and proceeded with construction. The Tartarian hypothesis may be speculative, but the built pattern it points to is undeniably there. And if the shells are reused, what about the systems that once ran through them? Returning to the engineering side, I focus on water. In multiple orphanages and receiving homes, early building descriptions reference large cisterns, rainwater collection systems, and connection to town sewers. This is normal for institutional buildings of the era. Less normal are accounts of extensive pre-existing drains or old wells whose construction predates the institution by generations. In one case, a Canadian receiving home's laundry annex was built atop a vaulted brick chamber discovered during excavation and promptly interpreted as a former ice house. The chamber's robust waterproofing and connection to a forgotten culvert suggest it once managed flowing water, not stored ice. The brickwork was finer than anything in the building above it. Tartaria writers seize on such features as remnants of an advanced hydraulic network, Tartarian water technology repurposed for boilers and washhouses. Engineers counter with prosaic explanations, old town wells, brewery cellars, or early municipal works. Both explanations are plausible, neither fully accounts for the precision and scale of what lies beneath. The orphan train depots too relied heavily on water, both for steam locomotives and sanitation. Under platforms and freight rooms, plans show tanks, sedimentation pits, and sumps to keep the tracks dry. Occasionally, these are built over existing brickwork, just as in the institutional sites. A water company survey from Concordia, dated 1921, describes an underground cistern beneath the depot's east wing, with capacity far exceeding the building's documented needs. The cistern was connected to culverts running toward the rail yard, their terminus unknown. No further mapping was undertaken. Whether you see Tartarian ghosts in these systems depends on how you connect the dots. What is not in dispute is that the movement of children in the 19th and early 20th centuries repeatedly intersected with and depended on unusually sophisticated and sometimes inherited water infrastructure. All that remains is to step back and ask what story these converging patterns actually support, and which questions they leave deliberately unanswered. By now, the narrative strands are clear. On one side, extensive documentation of child migration schemes, such as the orphan trains in the United States and British home children to Canada, framed by their organizers as rescue and by later critics as exploitation. The numbers are staggering. Between 1854 and 1929, approximately 200,000 American children were relocated westward. Between 1869 and 1932, over 100,000 British children were sent to Canada, Australia, and other colonies. The human cost is documented in testimonies, court records, and family searches that continue to this day. On the other side, the Tartarian reset myth combines mud flood imagery, erased Tartary labels, and architectural anomalies to argue that these programs were repopulation mechanisms after a civilizational wipeout. In this reading, the children were not rescued or exploited, they were redistributed into emptied territories, their origins obscured, their memories erased. The buildings that processed them were not Victorian charities, but repurposed Tartarian infrastructure, still functional, still connected to hydraulic and perhaps energetic systems we no longer understand. Mainstream scholarship rejects the Tartarian Empire as pseudo-history, pointing out that Tartary was a loose geographic term and that no global mudflood appears in geological or historical records. The evidence, they argue, has been misinterpreted by enthusiasts who see patterns where none exist. The buried windows are explained by rising street levels. The sealed vaults are explained by normal decommissioning. The hydraulic systems are explained by Victorian engineering ambition. Yet some of the physical cues that fuel Tartaria speculation, buried windows, sealed sublevels, and overbuilt hydraulic systems, are real. They simply have other, less cataclysmic explanations: incremental street raising, flood mitigation, reuse of earlier works. The buildings are strange, but strangeness alone does not prove a lost civilization. As an architectural researcher, I find myself in a narrow space between these positions. I cannot affirm that ancient Tartarian children were moved after a mud flood. The evidence does not support that narrative as fact. But I also cannot ignore that the buildings which housed and moved real historical children sit at the intersection of deep urban layers, reused infrastructure, and a broader pattern of unexplained architectural ambition. The Tartarian lens, misused, turns human suffering into set dressing for a cosmic conspiracy. Used carefully, it forces uncomfortable questions. Why do our histories of these children so rarely consider the environments that contain them? Why are substructures and service levels almost always omitted from public storytelling? Why do renovation records so often note the ceiling of spaces rather than their investigation? Why do the same architectural signatures appear in orphanages, receiving homes and depots across 3 continents, built by different organizations for different purposes, yet sharing the same proportions, the same buried windows, the same overbuilt hydraulic infrastructure? A curator at the Foundling Museum in London, when asked about the hospital's original drainage infrastructure, admitted that no comprehensive survey had ever been conducted. The building was demolished, the records were incomplete, the underground remained unmapped. She did not find this unusual. Perhaps it should be. Those questions do not prove Tartaria. They do suggest that something in the ground, literal or archival, remains unearthed. I return one last time to the Concordia depot archive. A photograph shows a group of children on the platform just before departure. Their faces are blurred by motion. The camera's focus catches instead the brick pilasters and the base of the wall behind them. A faint horizontal line runs across the lowest courses, a tide mark of discolored mortar where earth now presses from the outside. Another image, taken a century later at the same angle, shows the museum banners, the interpretive panels, the polished floor. The children are gone, their names preserved only if someone has traced them. The tide mark remains. Outside, the soil sits higher than it used to. One more course of bricks is invisible now. The building has not moved. The ground has risen around it, swallowing evidence that no one thought to preserve. In Tartarian videos, such lines are presented as high watermarks of a forgotten flood, proof that the old world lies just below our feet. In conservation reports, they are simply indicators of damp, a maintenance concern, a notation in files that almost no one reads. Between those readings lies the space where this investigation lives. A quiet acknowledgement that our built environment, especially the architecture that absorbed displaced children, retains traces of stories we have not fully told. Some of those stories are mundane, others are troubling. Very few are as neat as either the humanitarian myth or the Tartarian reset would like them to be. The children who passed through Concordia, through the receiving homes of Ontario and Quebec, and through the Foundling Hospital in Bloomsbury, left behind fragmentary records, names on manifests, photographs without captions, descendants still searching for origins. The buildings that processed them left behind fragmentary architecture, sealed vaults, buried windows, culverts that lead nowhere and are undocumented. The final shot is not a revelation, just a held frame. The depot wall, its buried window arch, the thin, dark line where brick meets earth. It is an image that asks rather than answers the question behind this investigation. Not whether ancient Tartarian children were moved, the evidence does not support that claim as literal history. But how many real children crossed thresholds whose true histories were already in brick and soil, half erased? The sealed doorway in Concordia remains closed. The photograph never explained what had been removed. Across continents, identical signatures appear in structures built decades apart, in an age when such coordination should have been impossible, unless, as Tartarian researchers quietly insist, these buildings were never built at all, but only inherited, occupied, and slowly buried by those who came after. I cannot prove that claim. I can only observe that the evidence aligns disturbingly well with patterns that Tartarian investigators have been cataloguing for years. The red brick facades, the oversized arches, the symmetry too perfect for period construction, the hydraulic infrastructure too complex for charitable institutions, the windows that sink decade by decade into rising ground, the sub-levels that renovation crews seal rather than survey, the archival notations that record anomalies without investigating them. The investigation does not end. It only pauses, waiting for the next renovation to uncover another vault, the next archive to yield another unexplained notation, the next photograph to surface showing a building that should not exist in the year it was taken. In Concordia, the depot still stands. The museum still tells the story of the orphan trains, and that story is true. Real children, real suffering, real lives scattered across a continent. But beneath the polished floors, the old culvert runs toward the rail yard, its terminus, Unmapped. And in the 1918 photograph, the windowsill still sits higher than it does today, recording a vertical movement that no exhibit panel mentions, no brochure explains, no official history acknowledges. The children are gone. The buildings remain. And somewhere in the space between official history and physical evidence, the questions multiply faster than the answers. The Tartarian hypothesis may never be proven, but it will not be disproven either. As long as the sealed vaults stay sealed, the buried windows stay buried, and the culverts run into darkness that no one has charted. The red lamp still burns in the archive, the tide mark still crosses the brick, and somewhere beneath our feet, the infrastructure waits.